Yesterday, a law was passed that we have been discussing for about 6 months. If you don't know all the details of the ins and outs of it, you can go back to our January, February, and March Maozui스라엘 report and read up on it, because it's not a simple issue. And it's not about a left or right. In fact, this law can be used by the left or the right for good or evil. Essentially what it is, and there's multiple laws in order, so it's not just a one-step thing. It's just the first step, and it has to do with the checks and balances in our democracy. If you're familiar with U.S. democracy, they have the legislative, they have the judiciary, and they have the executive. So you have the president that can do things, you have the Supreme Court that can make decisions, and you have the legislature, the Senate, and the House. So in Israel, we have the Knesset, which has a coalition. Out of 120 seats, you just need a majority, and you can pass a law. And then what happens is it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can rule on reasonableness and whether the law is reasonable. And the reason we call it that is because we have a Declaration of Independence, which states certain things that are considered basic laws and standards, but they're not a constitution that is, you absolutely have a really difficult time changing. And so, yesterday, the first step in a series of moves was made to pass a law that essentially neutered the power of the Supreme Court and their ability to object on the base of reasonableness. And so this isn't to say that every decision that the Supreme Court has made in canceling out laws is something that I would agree with, but it is a check and balance, and in every government you're going to have things that the government does that you like and things that you don't like, and that is the nature of a democracy. So what happened yesterday was they basically canceled out the reasonableness clause, which allows the Supreme Court to look at a law that is passed by the Knesset and say it's not reasonable and we're not allowing this law to pass. So we're almost in a catch-22, because the question is, can the Supreme Court cancel a law, saying that the Supreme Court can't cancel a law? Nonetheless, what ended up happening was people took to the streets. Now, they've been taking to the streets for the past 6 months on Saturday nights and on different occasions, shutting down and highways, for the most part peaceful, a couple of incidents here and there, but I don't like to focus on them because I don't feel like those are the story. I feel like those are outlying issues. And even the police were discussing that up until yesterday, where things got a little rougher because people were very emotional, the police had not been injured in all these protests. There had been some altercations, there had been some arrests, but the point is Israelis are not interested in burning our country down because we don't have another one. And so we have had people writing us, are you guys going to civil war? I've heard that, there's going to be war. And so let me just explain a couple things. We don't have a country if we don't have this country. We don't have a place to go to. And so there's no interest here in helping out Hamas and Hezbollah, which we fight on a regular basis, and terrorists on the street, by fighting each other. These are people on the street with Israeli flags saying that they want to live in a democratic nation where there are checks and balances and nobody is God and nobody's above the law. And so it was interesting to hear the people that passed the law. It was passed 64-0, which means everybody who opposed it, of the 120 seats, simply didn't vote. They were so upset about it, they wouldn't even take it to a vote. So then those who voted in favor got on the news and just described something, and I was thinking to myself, man, if I heard them describe this, I'd be like, oh, that sounds good, right? Like, this is good. The thing is nobody, if we learned anything, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so you don't ever want to be in a position where one person can just decide anything, or one group of people. And what we had yesterday, because everyone, the opposition was essentially saying, hey guys, can we, okay, you guys, you're in the majority, you can do things, can we have a pshara, like, what's the word in English, tone it down, you know, get some compromise. And basically what they're saying is that Netanyahu came into the meeting wanting to have this compromise conversation, and he was overrun by the people in his coalition. And this is where things get tricky, because Netanyahu is in a very vulnerable spot. He has court cases against him, and as long as he's prime minister, he has certain privileges and ability to maneuver as prime minister that he wouldn't have if he was just a regular citizen with these court cases against him. And their court cases essentially charging him on integrity issues. And I won't get into all those because that would just make this a really long video. But I do want you to know that I do not foresee any kind of war, a civil war between Israelis. We live in a country that is under constant threat of extinction, and we're aware of that. And if any of you guys watching have ever been in actual war, have ever fought in a war, you know that it doesn't matter how mad you get at your fellow soldier, you have a bigger enemy out there. And so we always have that in the back of our minds, and we love our country. We don't want to burn it to the ground. We just also don't want it to go run off the railroads. And so, and you should know, if you haven't listened to my Israeli Insiders podcast or read any of my writings, I'm generally not a political person. I don't see politics as the answer to everything. And so that's why when I present certain issues, I'm not presenting them as a left or right issue. I don't care. I believe in raising healthy families. And I believe if you have a healthy society based off of healthy families, you can even have corrupt leaders or problematic leaders that make your life miserable, and you can still have a good society. Whereas if you have godly leaders and a corrupt society with all broken families and just a mess of a society, that's a worst case scenario. And so that's where I'm coming from in general. If you go back and read the January, February, and March Miles Israel report, we went in depth explaining that Israeli politics is not as simple as politics in other countries. It's not even a left and right. Like, there is no clear cut, wow, I'm a left person, I'm a right person, because the issues don't feel that they don't go down on the left and right. There are things that I agree with on the left, and there are things that I agree with on the right. And so actually every time I vote, it's some different political party. I vote because I believe that we should, but I don't rely on politics to save me or my country. I do think that certain ways of doing things in politics can definitely make our lives more miserable. And so I do ask for your prayers during this time that Israel would walk in the path that God has called her to walk. And sometimes it takes some wrestling, and sometimes it's messy. And the closest that we have come to even discussing military issues is the refusal of some reservists in the Air Force particularly, which is Israel's like pearl. This is like the part of the military that goes out and fights and does strikes and keeps us out of having to go in with ground troops, and very, very valuable to us. Hundreds of them, in fact 1,000 signed a document saying that they wouldn't serve under a government that would pass such laws and not have any checks and balances, because they wouldn't trust the decisions that are being made. 500 of those about were pilots, which is a huge number in Israel. But this is not them saying we're going to take our planes and attack you. It's them saying we don't want to serve because this is a volunteer basis. They're reservists. They're not required to come in. We don't want to serve, and we're concerned about the decisions that a government that has no checks and balances would make. So again, I want to set your heart at ease. We're not going to kill each other. we don't want to help our enemies. That's what they would like, and that's what they're watching. But it is definitely a turbulent time, and expect to see more protests on the streets, and expect to see high spirits, but don't expect to see us self-destruct. That would be very self-destructive and ignorant. Expect to see our economy affected, which is one more reason for us to stand here and be strong and be what we are, which is Maoz, which means strength and a fortress, and know that there's going to be more people in need, and be there for them, and know that really our only answer is to walk in the path that God has given Israel. And so in your prayers this morning, if you would pray that Israel would walk in the path that God has set for her, and give us leaders who fear him, who will walk in integrity and lead us in the path of the Lord, then I would really appreciate it. I'm Shani Ferguson. Shalom from Jerusalem. And good morning.